Have you noticed something strange lately? For years, the electric vehicle race looked almost settled. New EV companies were grabbing headlines. Traditional automakers were scrambling to catch up, and every month seemed to bring another prediction that gasoline engines were on their way out. Then Toyota made a move that got the entire industry talking, not because it launched the fastest EV, not because it built the cheapest battery, but because it challenged an assumption that almost everyone had accepted as fact. And once you see why, you might look at the future of transportation very differently. The story starts with a question. What if the biggest car company in the world wasn't actually behind? What if it was simply playing a different game? For years, Toyota faced criticism from investors, analysts, and even competitors. While other companies announced aggressive electric vehicle targets, Toyota seemed unusually cautious to many observers. That caution looked like hesitation. Some called it a mistake, others called it denial. But inside Toyota, executives were looking at a problem that many people weren't talking about, a problem involving batteries, infrastructure, raw materials, and something even more important, scale. Because selling a few thousand electric cars is one thing, transforming transportation for billions of people is something else entirely at first. That distinction didn't seem to matter. The EV market was booming. New startups were appearing. Everywhere, valuations exploded. Companies promised a future where electric cars would replace nearly every gasoline vehicle on the road, and in that environment, Toyota's strategy looked old-fashioned. But there was one detail that kept bothering them. Detail that would eventually shape one of the company's most important decisions. The world wasn't moving at the same speed. Some countries were rapidly adopting EVs, others weren't. Some regions had charging networks, others barely had reliable electrical infrastructure. And Toyota kept asking a question. Few people wanted to answer, how do you reduce emissions globally, if much of the world isn't ready for a fully electric transition? At the time, that question sounded inconvenient. Years later, it started sounding important. Then came the move that changed the conversation. Instead of betting everything on a single solution, Toyota doubled down on what it called a multi-pathway approach. That phrase doesn't sound dramatic, but its implications were enormous. Rather than focusing exclusively on battery electric vehicles, Toyota continued investing across multiple technologies, hybrids, plug-in, hybrids, hydrogen, more efficient combustion systems. And yes, electric vehicles too, but many critics immediately pushed back to them. This looked like Toyota refusing to commit, refusing to choose a side, refusing to embrace the future. But Toyota leadership saw something different. They believed the future might not arrive in a straight line. And this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because if Toyota was wrong, the company risked falling behind one of the biggest technological shifts in automotive history. But if Toyota was right, much of the industry could be concentrating resources in ways that created new vulnerabilities. Either way, the stakes were enormous. The world's largest automaker wasn't making a small bet, it was making a bet about the future of mobility itself. Then market conditions began to shift. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to raise new questions. Consumer demand became more complicated. Charging concerns remained a challenge for many drivers. Battery supply chains faced pressure. Manufacturers discovered that scaling production was harder than presentations and investor slides had suggested. Suddenly, the conversation became less about headlines and more about economics. And that's where Toyota's strategy started attracting attention, because hybrids vehicles many people had considered a temporary step continued selling in large numbers. Consumers who weren't ready to go fully electric still wanted better fuel efficiency, they still wanted lower emissions, and they wanted solutions available today, not someday. Toyota had spent decades building expertise in exactly that area, an area many competitors had largely moved beyond. What once looked conservative began looking surprisingly strategic. But the most interesting part wasn't what Toyota had already built, it was what the company was preparing next. Behind the scenes, engineers continued working on technologies that could dramatically change the equation. Among them were advanced battery systems that promised improvements in range, charging speed, and efficiency. If those efforts succeeded, Toyota could potentially combine its manufacturing scale with next-generation technology. And that possibility got people paying attention because scale matters a lot. Building a breakthrough in a laboratory is difficult. Deploying it across millions of vehicles is an entirely different challenge. Toyota has spent decades mastering that challenge, which means every major technology decision it makes carries unusual weight. Then something unexpected happened. The debate itself began to change. Instead of asking whether electric vehicles would succeed, more people started asking a different question. What does the transition actually look like? Will every market move at the same pace? Will every consumer make the same choice? Will one technology dominate? Or will multiple solutions coexist for decades? These questions didn't have simple answers, and that's exactly why Toyota's position became harder too. Dismiss DOT, the company wasn't arguing that electric vehicles had no future. Far from it. Toyota was investing heavily in EV development. The real argument was about timing, infrastructure, resources, and practical adoption across vastly different regions of the world. In other words, the debate wasn't just technological, it was logistical, economic, global, and those factors are often harder to solve than engineering problems. That's when competitors started paying closer attention. Whether they agreed with Toyota or not, they couldn't ignore the possibility that the market might be more complex than expected if consumer behavior remained diverse. Flexibility could become a major advantage if infrastructure developed unevenly. Multiple technologies might remain relevant longer than forecasts suggested. And if battery materials faced constraints, alternative approaches could become increasingly valuable. Suddenly, Toyota's strategy wasn't just a strategy, it was a challenge to the industry's assumptions, a challenge to investors, a challenge to competitors, and perhaps most importantly, a challenge to the idea that technological revolutions always unfold in predictable ways. History suggests they rarely do. The technologies that win are not always the first dot, not always the most exciting, not always the most talked about. Sometimes, they are simply the ones that fit reality best. And that brings us back to Toyota's latest move, because the move itself may be less important than what it reveals. It reveals a company willing to risk criticism in order to pursue a long vision. It reveals uncertainty in a market many people assumed was settled, and it reveals that the future of transportation may be far more complicated than a simple race between winners and losers. Maybe electric vehicles dominate exactly as many expect. Maybe hybrids remain important longer than predicted. Maybe hydrogen finds a larger role. Maybe an entirely new breakthrough changes everything again. The truth is that nobody knows for certain. Not investors, not analysts, not competitors, and not even Toyota. But perhaps that's the most fascinating part of this story. While everyone else was arguing about which technology would win, Toyota was asking a different question. What if the future isn't one answer? What if it's several? And if that's true, then Toyota's latest move isn't really about cars at all. It's about whether the biggest transformations happen through disruption or through adaptation, and the answer to that question determine much more than who sells the most vehicles. It may determine how the next era of transportation is built. But there's another layer to this story that rarely makes the headlines, because when people talk about the future of cars, they usually focus on technology, batteries, charging, speeds, range, software, yet some of the biggest battles are happening far away from showrooms and factory floors. They're happening in supply chains. Consider what it takes to build millions of electric vehicles, not hundreds, not thousands, millions. The demand for critical materials increases dramatically. Manufacturers compete for resources. Governments become involved. Entire industries reorganize around securing future supply. That's where Toyota's thinking becomes especially interesting. For decades, the company built its reputation on efficiency. Not just efficient vehicles, efficient systems, efficient manufacturing, efficient use of resources. So when Toyota evaluates the future, it isn't only asking which technology works best, it's asking which technology can realistically scale across the world. That's a very different question. And sometimes, the answer changes depending on where you look. A driver in a major city may have easy access to charging. A driver in a rural region may not. One country may rapidly expand its energy infrastructure. Another may take much longer. The result? A future that looks less uniform than many forecasts assume. And if that's true, flexibility becomes incredibly valuable. The companies that survive major transitions are often not the ones with the strongest predictions, the ones prepared for multiple outcomes. History is filled with examples. Businesses that bet everything on a single future often struggled when reality took a different path. Toyota appears determined not to make that mistake.